Jordi, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I really
My
appreciate it.
pleasure.
So, for our congregation, this message series that we're doing at the end of the summer is all about learning about our neighbors. So, I'm asking everybody that I speak with to share a little bit about what their connection is to our area. And in your case, our area is really kind of the whole state of Pennsylvania. So, I'm curious to know, did you grow up in Pennsylvania? How did you come to
hmm
live in the place that you
hmm
call home now?
hmm Yeah, thank you for asking that. And I'm thrilled to be here. And I love that your email was very flattering. So that works. um, I grew up, and even saying it will bring out my accent. I grew up in East Tennessee and Knoxville, Tennessee,
Okay.
and we'll get to this more later, maybe. But I did grow up going to Unitarian Church, TVUUC, Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Church,
Okay.
for
Yeah.
most of my childhood until my adolescence. Um, and then I kind of joke that uh, I was fated to be in Pennsylvania because I went to college in Minnesota, and then my first job was in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
Mm.
And uh, Virginia, who's my wife, she ended up, she was working on a PhD in English. So she taught some adjunct at Lafayette. And then we went away for several years, grad school for me, other things. Um, we actually got to live in Spain for a couple of years. And then when she was on the job market, and people may know something about the academic job market, um, you kind of take, like, if you're an English professor, you take a job if you got one, right?
Yeah.
And because she'd been an adjunct in Lafayette, 7 years later, they hired her in a 1-year visiting position. So we were back in the Lehigh Valley in Easton. And then because Lafayette and Bucknell, which is where she teaches now, like, for them, that was like, oh, she's been at Lafayette and she succeeded. So then she got a job offer at Bucknell. So I'm 49. And so, 24 of my adult years, I've lived in Pennsylvania. And I really do embrace it. I love living in rural Pennsylvania. I live literally 2 blocks from the Susquehanna River,
Mm.
the longest non-navigable river in the United States. There's a book called Susquehanna Valley River of Dreams that, like with many books, I've read the first chapter. But if you know the Susquehanna River, and more with the work I do, I actually feel like more than kind of a top-down view of like, I'm very visual, but if I think about Pennsylvania, I tend to think of watersheds. So the
Mhm.
Susquehanna River is, goes into the Chesapeake, it goes through Harrisburg, and then actually just a few miles from my house, it splits into the North Branch and the West Branch. I don't know why it's not East and West. It's a little confusing. I live on the West Branch. Actually, my home church here now in Northumberland is at the confluence of the North and the West branches.
Mhm.
And then the West Branch goes out into NEPA, where I do a lot of work. Sorry, the North Branch, and up into New York State. The West Branch goes west from here by Lock Haven. It goes, I don't actually quite know. I don't know that side of it as well. Anywho, so yeah, I live in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm on the borough council here. I don't know if you knew
Mm.
that, but
Mm.
and in Union County, which is named for the Union.
Mhm.
And I, I think the other thing that's been interesting, and there's been some op-eds and sort of conversation about this, is the idea of Greater Appalachia. So
Mhm.
I did grow up in East Tennessee, which, if people know the South, East Tennessee is not like the rest of Tennessee. In the Civil War, there was the University of Tennessee are the volunteers because they volunteered to fight. There was a volunteer regiment. If it hadn't been for Kentucky and Virginia, sort of above it, East Tennessee might have seceded from the Confederacy. And
Mm.
I don't think we should be under any illusions that it was full of like racial justice warriors. There was a lot of resentment towards the plantation class and other things.
Mm.
But I'm also like, and if I'm going on too long, cut me off. But like, I'm used to being a bit of an insider outsider. The term code switching, like, that comes up in racial things. I think it's useful in other contexts. I can talk like I'm from East Tennessee, and I am, but my mom's from the Midwest. My father's an immigrant from Spain. And even when you met me, like, I definitely feel like I understand rural PA, and there's things about it I love, and little like quirkiness, but I'm never from here for the people who are from here.
Yeah.
Right. I'm sort of perpetually in between being a local and an outsider. So I think some of the work I do that actually serves me because, I can, like, represent this area, but I just like to be careful that I'm not somebody, and I even, in a lot of the work I do, I talk about people who are from here.
Yeah.
Right. And uh, many years ago, I was part of a grassroots political organization that started here in Union County, and the leadership group was about 9 people. 8 of us were transplants like me, and one was from. The work I do now with something called the Hub for Progress, which is similar to Action Together. The leadership team has changed, but it's been, currently it's like 6 or 7 people, and 6 of us are from. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that you want to balance, right? Like on some of the work we do, people, like there's a colleague I have right now who grew up in Wilkes-Barre, went to college somewhere else. He's in his early 20s, and we have a real brain drain in rural PA. That's something that people are aware of. We have lots of institutions of higher education, including Bucknell, where I worked for a long time, and where my wife works, that are bringing people in from other places, while a lot of young people, including my own children, I have 2 18-year-olds and a 22-year-old, like they probably won't live here. And so anyway, I'm sorry, I'm kind of all over the place, but like I also feel like I'm a child of Greater Appalachia. And I think in terms of culture, that matters. And I think, when we see the Confederate flags, as much as that's a racist symbol, it resonates in rural Pennsylvania. And the last thing, and then I'll hush, is like when Georgia elected Warnock and
Ossoff,
right?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
In 2020, I think we all know it had a lot to do with massive investment and turnout in the whole state, but especially the rural Black and Hispanic part of the state. And as much as that's important wherever it is, like I do a lot of work in Wilkes-Barre and in Scranton. Hazleton is, if people don't know, is the most interesting, a small city of about 25,000 or 30,000 in Luzerne County, which is now 55% Dominican. But in general, rural Pennsylvania is very, very white. And we need to talk about multiracial coalitions and all of that. But in the political reality is we have to acknowledge that there's no way to recreate exactly what happened in Georgia, where you have massive turnout of the rural population that are people of color, because they're really not here. Yeah. Lewisburg, where I live, is 91% white, and it's a diverse town for this area. My county is like 93% white. 5 of the 10, if you look at congressional districts, and you just measure how much the population is white, 5 of the 10 whitest districts in the United States are in Pennsylvania, congressional districts. So that's just a reality we have to acknowledge.
Yeah. Well, I imagine for organizing work, it is probably helpful, like you said, to have that balance. And that's one of the benefits, I imagine, of not being the person who's from here, is that you have some level of relatability, like you talked about, common experiences somewhat, but also you have the ability to be curious in a different way, to not assume certain things, and to get different kind of conversations going with people, because you can genuinely ask them, what was it like to grow up here, things like that. And I appreciate your talk about watersheds. I just realized recently that I've spent most of my life moving up and down the Schuylkill River. I grew up, literally, when I looked at a map, I realized how close my house growing up in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, was to the Schuylkill. And then I lived in South Philly by the Schuylkill, and then now I live in Phoenixville, where like I could practically throw a rock from my window and hit the Schuylkill. So yeah,
that's it. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and so the way that you referenced it a little bit, the way that I first learned who you were was I actually attended an online panel early in the pandemic, somewhat early, leading up to the 2020 election, that was hosted by a Unitarian Universalist group here in Pennsylvania called UU Justice PA. And so you are a Unitarian Universalist, I think you mentioned already. How did you were raised Unitarian Universalist? So that's how you first discovered it, I guess. Yeah. I'm
a lifer, and I'm married to a lifer.
Oh, wow.
So we feel a little bit like we're celebrities. I don't know this, and I am, I have a lot of sociology training in my background, so I care about the numbers when it's relevant. I feel like the Unitarian Church, at the generation that's my parents and my wife Virginia's parents, like interracial marriage was a driver for Unitarian growth, right? So my father was raised Catholic and my mom was Protestant, and she had been divorced. And so, not that my dad was that into Catholicism, but it was like, there was nowhere else to get married. And Virginia's father is Jewish and her mother is Protestant. So we're both children of that. Growing up, my parents got divorced when I was 5, and they did a good job and co-parented and all that, but like my dad wasn't part of the church equation. It was all my mom. And so we would go to church, and I had a lot of positive memories of being in the space. And it was kind of a big church compared to other churches. Like the church I'm in now is a pretty small church, big building, choir, really, there was great like playground. Um, and when I got into high school, my mom had some sort of spiritual yearnings, as Unitarians want to do. She actually was joined a Quaker meeting house, so I was kind of more of a Quaker for a little bit in high school. And then so I kind of missed out on that youth experience. And in college, I went more to Quaker meeting. And then when we lived in Bethlehem, Virginia, and I started to go back to Unitarian Church. And in Charlottesville, where we lived, we went there some. And when we moved here, we went kind of casually. And when we had kids, it was like a big deal for us. Like, not just to be part of a community of shared values, but I mean, I really feel like our church, where we are in very, red area, and not just red, but where there's a lot of not just religious conservatism, but even with Mastriano is the most recent example, but scary Christian nationalism. It was really important to us to like plant a flag and be kind of missionaries and proselytizers for like, you can be a person of faith and have a different value system, but also a little bit like it helps that our kids can be like, yeah, when I went to church, right? And so like church around here means something different. And so we can kind of like hermit crabs, like inhabit that shell.
Yeah.
So
Can I
anyway,
ask you,
that, yeah.
do you think growing up Unitarian Universalist affected your choice of career? Like, do you think that's part of why you do what you do now?
I think for sure my mom was not super involved in things, but definitely had a very heightened sense of social justice for sure. And like that that influenced me and things I wanted to do. I think both of my parents, my mom was a social worker, my father was a physician. So like an ethic of service to others was really important.
Yeah.
I think that I think that like an awareness of so like one of my favorite things to say in organizing is be kinder than necessary because everyone's fighting their own battle. And another one is and all of these I've borrowed or tweaked from other people. Another one is be kind to people and ruthless to systems. So
be kind to people and ruthless to systems.
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh.
I like those a lot. And I honestly, like, I haven't said this publicly a lot, but I have a mode where I get into kind of organizer speak when I'm talking to other, canvassers or volunteers. And I do feel like I'm channeling a little bit of like broadly spiritual leadership, right? Like, I don't ever hide that I'm a Unitarian. I don't, this is a longer thing. I'm actually kind of an atheist Unitarian. Like, I
That's
gave a
okay,
sermon.
as you know.
I gave a sermon at our church that said I don't believe in God, I believe in church. But so that kind of sort of spiritual energy or whatever you want to call it, I do think it's important. So I think for me, and I hope this sounds okay, like there are different modes of political discourse or like social movement discourse, right, in American culture. And like a friend of mine, Cherie Clark, who's African American, like she can tap into like the Black church discourse, which is, even if she doesn't say God or Jesus, but it's about like, we all recognize that, especially from the civil rights movement. There's a kind of like, I don't want to say Jefferson, but like there's a kind of like higher ideal Unitarian discourse, and it's in my head, and I tap into it sometimes. And so I never really thought about that, but I think that that's an influence. The transcendentalists. Like I'm a youth group leader, and I have been for a long time for a church. So we've taken like several trips to Boston, which like was important to me as for the youth for like learning my own faith. So I think that's there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so can you tell us a little bit about, you mentioned it a bunch of times now, but what does the day-to-day work look like of a political organizer? What do you do on an average day? And then what goals are you working towards?
So, I mean, if anybody's watching this because they're thinking they're interested in like a career, like I'm not normal, like I'm a caboose to my wife, it's not really a career I chose. I thought that I was going to be sort of a person doing what I'm doing now, and then maybe I would get a PhD and be a professor. And because of life stuff, it was easier for me to get a PhD and be a professor for 15 years. And then different things, a lot was Trump being elected. I was like, I need to be out in the world doing things. So I don't really think of myself as a political organizer per se, only because that's usually about electoral campaigns. And I think of myself as an organizer, and there's community organizing, issue organizing, and political organizing. Like in a campaign always has a target, an ask, and then the plan. So a lot of what I do is, and actually what I think I bring to the work I do right now with Action Together NEPA, which this is a little bit wonky, but does both community organizing and political organizing. There are organizations that do that. So I work on both. I'm doing more political now. But what I was trying to say was it's important, like, for the broader movement. Like, I think about the movement a lot, and like within the movement, there are organizations that are going to be good at working on a specific thing, but we need larger infrastructures about the movement that help those different organizations do campaigns. So like social change is campaigns run by organizations that are linked in a movement. And some of my academic work, most of it was about networks and organizations. So I'm very interested in that layers. Like, how do we build the durable systems of coordination and communication that keep social movement organized? And it's often kind of an afterthought. Like, one thing that I noticed in 2020 and the uprising, and there's a woman, Laura Putnam, who's a professor at Pittsburgh, and she's not a Unitarian, but she did great work basically showing the number of spontaneous protests in 2020 around police violence and racial justice was a factor of 10 greater than the women's movement or the Tea Party, right? So if you looked at how many towns had like a spontaneous event, it was, I'm making the numbers up a little bit, maybe it was roughly 30 for the Tea Party, 40 or 50 for the women's movement, and 300, right?
So, I remember that when that information came out, that it was you're talking about essentially the summer 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, and just the sheer number of protests was so much more than anything before.
I think Laura was on the panel that you saw.
Oh, maybe. Yeah.
Or I shared her slides. So what I wanted to say about the bigger picture, and then I'll hush, is like, I think this is not a well-tested, this is not a hypothesis, it's what I call a hunch-othesis. It's a hunch. I think that in American history, and if we look at social movements and social change and political change, there was a process of building out that infrastructure and then the movement, and sort of what we see is like all the people in the street and like all the coordinated action, partly a lot because of, honestly, information technology and being able to bring people together quickly. We've inverted it, right? We had like everybody out doing things, and we didn't have the like that piece. And so between, like, my core mission for myself personally is to help build that. So there's a thing called the Hub for Progress, which is I'm not employed by, but it's an intentional effort since 2017 to build that. And Action Together is part of that. I joke badly that I'm a professional hat rack. My kids hate it, but like all the things I do for me are part of that. So I have a podcast where I'm bringing people on to talk about that. I am doing community and political organizing, and then the Hub. So to answer your question, sorry, just like a typical day is, well, I mean, how many people say there's not a typical day, but like, let me pause. Like fun fact I like to bring up is like a presidential campaign in the year that it runs goes from being a handful of people in Iowa or wherever, in New Hampshire, to, like, if you look at the amount of revenues and the number of people who are employed, the equivalent of a Fortune 500 company, right? So it's scaling incredibly fast. And so we're in that kind of period, right? Action Together, that I was a member of, and then they asked me to be an employee, went from 1 half-time employee in February to 6.5 employees now. And
because so, the election's coming up. Okay. Yeah.
100%. Now, we don't just like a lot of the money we had to do door-to-door canvassing, which is a lot of what we're doing now, was to talk to people about issues and values, and then why Josh Shapiro has done a good job. So it's not per se like endorsing him, but it is about him. So so that, like, there was money there to do that, so they could bring me on to train people to be canvassers and to be paid to do that.
Got it.
So for me, and I'm not, there's a thing called a field organizer, who's the person who's really like the logistics person, and like I have done that. Right now I'm like trying to occupy this middle space where, like, so like a typical week would be, for me, one day would be working with volunteers and volunteer leadership about how does their interests connect to the paid program. Another day would be, we have a rural hospital closing in Berwick, which is in our footprint is our geographic area, which is huge. It's basically the upper right quadrant of PA. Now, because we've been around, and I kind of mean loosely Action Together in the movement, this happened in another town called Sunbury, and now it's happening in Berwick. And so we
happening near here too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we can start to connect the dots about why it's happening and what's happening. And then, and so that's another day. And tomorrow there's like a press conference that I'll be at in a supportive role. Then later in the day, I'm going and I'm training for people in a very intense sort of door-to-door way. Because when we do door-to-door canvassing, we're not training people to sort of memorize and by rote and repeat a sort of few narrow talking points. Like that's a thing that's often done in political campaigns, and maybe it's helpful to kind of turn humans into like your airwaves. You know, we're trying to build relationships with people through conversations, and we'll often are going back to people we talked to already in March or April, or new people. Mm-hmm. And you know, today I was talking to a 90-year-old Republican man, and I really thought it was not going to go well. Like just sort of little signs, like the kind of house he had, big no trespassing sign. And he sat on his porch. I also had two people I was training with me. One who was like, if you know, is sort of overtly trans. And I was like, oh, I don't know how this is going to go. Like, what if he says something really awful? And like, they're new and they've been a little bit concerned about, you know, which I totally get, like
safety,
safety, all of that. We, you know, I always talk about safety first, and I tell my canvassers the most important thing is like the first rule and the fourth rule of safety canvassing are the same, and I'll repeat them. And it's like, trust your spidey sense. Because I can go into lots of situations with all my white cultural armor that they can't. Now, sometimes, you know, if the person who opens the door is a 23-year-old trans person, they might be much better. And that's one of the fun parts. Anyway, this 90-year-old gentleman who I was expecting the worst from, like I'm often being challenged in my own expectations about who people are. And he was saying that his wife has dementia, so he's not sure if he's going to vote. And we started talking about absentee voting. And he was open-minded about all of the candidates who are all Democratic candidates. And he was really nice, and he saw the two with me, and he said, you know, it's nice to see you girls, like that they rolled with it, you know. One is transitioning. I was like, I'm sorry about that. She was like, ah, it's fine. So you know, a lot of my day, because we don't have an office and I am in this regional place, I live out of my car. I call it my office. It's my office car. We maybe are going to get an office, but I think as much as it would be nice to have a central location, because we're in many counties, it's like if the office is in Wilkes-Barre or in Scranton, then everybody's going to think we're a Scranton organization. And I think this is true everywhere. I don't know if it's more true in Pennsylvania, but like that local parochialism is something, like in a way I think is great. And I like there are lots of little stories about little places in Pennsylvania that I like. One of the places I canvassed earlier this year, Freeland, had like 3 kinds of Catholic church, you know, like Polish Catholic, Roman Catholic, and one other. And I was like, I didn't even know there were that many. But so my point is, like, if there's something to be gained by being this kind of network of the 6 of us who work, and we're all in different places. But that means that literally I dropped some hangers off for my executive director and gave her some paperwork, and she gave me a picture that I brought, you know. So there's a lot of like that. So
commuting, driving around, passing things off. Yeah.
Commuting, and you know, you asked me not to do this call from my car, and I was like, she was like, I want you to be safe. I was like, that's cute, but like
you do a lot of calls from your car, it sounds like.
I do. And there's kind of a running joke, which is the GPS doesn't interrupt a call. And even though I do usually know where I'm going, I am often like, I'll be like, there's a running joke with the staff, and we're all good friends. It's like, I'm like, oh, where am I now? Because like I missed the exit that I was,
right. So one of the things you mentioned, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize the difference, is the different types of organizing. And let me make sure I have it right. So, because there's political organizing, which is more about electing certain people to office. There's issue organizing, which might be like, we are a group that organizes around reproductive rights issues and tries to get a particular set of laws on the books or policies on the books or whatever it is. They have a particular perspective on that issue that they're trying to win. And then community organizing is more like, what are the needs of this community? Sometimes community organizers might be more progressive or have a certain value sort of system, but it's also mostly about like, what does the community say that they want, and how can we help them talk to their elected leaders and get what they want out of their elected officials? Is that a pretty accurate summary?
Yeah, I think so. And my 3 is not, somebody else might be something different. And there are people who like think a lot about sort of models of organizing. I'm not as invested in that. Like there's a thing from my academic work, which is like weak words and strong concepts, which is like, can we agree on the concept? I don't really care what you call it. So for me, and this is something I got from George Lakey, who's an emeritus professor at Swarthmore. He's up there. He's like, I'll share with you if you want to share. He came and did a really great like whole day training for the Hub for Progress, the other thing I mentioned, in a barn, which was a lot of fun up here. But he talked about campaigns, and he might have gotten it from somewhere else. But for me, the campaign is like the unit of work. And so the campaign is the target, the ask, and the plan. And so in a community, for me in community organizing, the target is often the community itself. How can we get a park built? That may morph into more of an issue campaign, which is we want the city council to do this. But for sure, the clearer line is I'm asking you to vote for this person. That's a political campaign,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Does that help?
Yeah,
Like
no, that makes sense.
whoever is the target and what the ask is sort of defines a campaign. So to me, that's maybe even too general. I don't, if you have academics or whatever, they might not love this, but like it's a very useful like context for me because well, the other piece of this is there's capacity and then there's campaigns. So a lot of what we do, like if we're putting together a newsletter to send out, like does that help a specific campaign? No, but it builds capacity. So one thing is a lot of people in organizing talk about the campaign and they downplay the capacity. So I'm big on that. I'm like, we have to always build up the capacity, and every campaign ideally creates more capacity for tomorrow. I mean, that's an ideal. We're not there, but that's one of the
Capacity
problems.
meaning people who are engaged, paying attention. Okay,
People who
yeah.
are engaged, information. Like one
Mhm.
of the big problems with all kinds of organizing, especially political, everywhere, I think, is every 4 years in Pennsylvania, because we're a swing state, a presidential campaign or gubernatorial campaign rolls in. I've been through this cycle since 2004 in Pennsylvania, and they say things that I totally agree with. We're all going to work together, and then after this, blah blah blah, and they walk off with the data. Like I've literally had volunteers steal from the campaign office in my county. I hope this doesn't go too far. The list of people volunteered because I knew that they wouldn't really give us the data. So I call them, I got this from someone else, we call it sandcastles on the beach, right? They build up a sandcastle of civic infrastructure in terms of who knows each other, trust. I mean, trust is really important. They go away and then the tide comes in and it washes away. And it means that like those of us who live here and keep redoing this, like it is maddening. It's like, oh, it's 2022. Is that what year it is? It's 2022. You want to run for state office? Wouldn't you like to know who between 2008 and 2020 came to any event about tax fair? Wouldn't you like to know that? We don't know that. All of that information walked away.
Yeah. Yeah. And campaigns, I imagine, are where most of the money goes when it comes to
They
raising money to
are,
help with organizing. Yeah. Yeah.
and that's an issue because a lot of donors, there's so am wandering a little bit into politics, and I know that you're a C3, but we're not endorsing anybody. So like I know this law well too. So like I get a lot of asks for Mandela Barns in Wisconsin. Somebody actually the day told me that they're having a barbecue in Philly to send money to Georgia. I was like, why are you doing that? Right. So we have a kind of like the small dollar donor model that Howard Dean and Obama and other people piloted is great, but it also means that we're cannibalizing people and money's going to sort of these national star-studded kind of campaigns. Amy McGrath in Kentucky raised a huge amount of money, and people I know in Kentucky thought she wasn't the best candidate. On the other side, John Fetterman, I think, is a really interesting political candidate. And his first campaign launch ad, I thought was not great. It was kind of like painted Pennsylvania. It's like a lot of Rust Belt towns that are dying, and he was the person who could reach those voters. But I think the audience for that was national donors who wanted to hear, I'm the person who can win these small Rust Belt towns. And other ads from Fetterman are not so like dark. So sorry if I kind of wandered into, I don't know where kind of I ended up there, but like, oh, the money. So that's a reality. There's a nonprofit industrial complex. And this is the thing I like the least about the work I do. It's like, I said to somebody literally the other day, and I'm really good at coming up with bad metaphors, but I was like, I don't like the work that needs to be done is this work. And I can explain it to people. A lot of the donors want to know, I give you this much money in 2022 and we're going to win. I'm like, a lot of these political races to flip the Pennsylvania legislature, which is a goal for UU Justice PA, which is different than your church. We're a 501c4, we're allowed to say that. We need to flip the Pennsylvania legislature. And the only way to do that is to win in places that are outside of the collar counties and outside of Philadelphia. Anybody who looks at Pennsylvania politics will see that. Where are those places? Where I am in NEPA, the Lehigh Valley, Altoona, Hershey, Harrisburg, maybe Gettysburg, Williamsport. Like I might have left some out, Erie, right? But it's these medium-sized cities that are part of the post-industrial landscape of PA. So we all know what the strategic investments that need to be made. The Democratic Party in Pennsylvania is terrible at making them because it's an incumbency protection machine. The people who are national or statewide donors want to see wins, and they want to see them in one cycle. And a lot of those races need 1, 2, 3, or 4 cycles of investment. And so it doesn't happen. So anyway, I don't like the nonprofit industrial complex because what it means is we know the whole arc of work. Like we at Action Together and there are some other great organizations in Pennsylvania, and if you want some, I can tell you others that I think are doing this work in their area. But we often have to like do one thing to justify to some donors what we're doing so that we have the money to do the other work. And anybody who's worked in nonprofit administration knows this. And so what I said was, it's like there's salsa music on and I'm dancing the polka when all I needed to be doing was moshing. I just want to mosh, right? And I don't want to do dancing to the wrong music. And there's too much of that.
Right. Because that's how you get a grant or a donor or yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Because
Nonprofits can certainly relate to that. Yeah.
We cannot raise enough money. Like churches are actually interesting, basically most of you churches, I think, raise enough money from their own activities to do what they want to do. We can't do that. Like the constituency of people for action, we have members and they pay dues. That money is not enough to do the work we need to do. And we can't have enough bake sales or sell enough t-shirts to cover it. So I would love another model, right? Or a couple of rich members. So, but
but it is what it is right now. Yeah. Well, you said something earlier that also reminded me of something else I wanted to ask you, which is fascinating. I hadn't thought about it, but it rings very true to me. This idea that that movements now, because largely of social media and other things, can form before there's infrastructure, or with very different kinds of infrastructure, at least. And I think one of the things that I've noticed and that I've heard a lot from people in our congregation is that so many people after the 2016 election, the presidential election, became really politicized, sort of woke up to all of these social justice issues and really wanted to get involved. And I noticed that we often don't have the vocabulary. Like the average person doesn't necessarily recognize what they can do besides vote, obviously, donate money, and attending protests is kind of this like amorphous idea that that's what it means to be an activist, right? But who organizes the protests, and are they connected to these larger systems that are thinking about a strategy, or and that has shifted. I think I hadn't thought about it until you said it, because when I look back at what I learned about the civil rights movement, that was the movement level, right? But then there was SNCC, there were organizations. There's more that I'm not thinking of at the moment, that undergirded that action. That was the big crowd, right, or the big speech, or the big moment. And it's different now. So what my question for you was really like, as people think about what does it mean to get involved, are there other ways that you would encourage people who are sort of newly awakened to this to start thinking about participation in their community or in a movement towards justice, besides voting, giving money, and protests? And if that's what you think is best, tell me that too. But are there other ways that people should? Yeah.
I mean, look, giving your wealth, wisdom, and work is always great. So for sure. So especially like members of WellSprings are sort of in the Philly orbit. Is that right?
We're in Chester County. So we're one of the collar counties, the farthest one to the west of the collar counties, but
yeah. I have like 48 of the 67 counties memorized. I know where Chester is. So first of all, like I definitely wear like I'm a rural organizer, and like sometimes Philly is like both like the promised land and like frustrating, right? Because it's like there's so many progressives there, right? Like I have never, except when I lived in Barcelona, I've never lived in a place where my political values were the majority. And like I literally the other day was talking to some organizing friends. I was like, I don't know if I know what it feels like to win, which is not healthy, because I won my own race for borough council. But that aside,
well, and we do have members who have that experience, just FYI. Like we have some members who live in Berks County and commute in from Berks, from Reading area, it's a mix.
But Berks, if we were talking earlier, saying like to flip the Pennsylvania House, like pretty sure there are places in Berks that like are close. Berks, Lancaster, that area is an important area. Anyway, what can people do? So I think that there's a lot of people who talk about the larger context of like sort of the structure of nonprofits and organizations. And there's a woman, Theda Skocpol, Skocpol, that she may be a little bit known. Actually, Laura Putnam, who I mentioned, is somebody who's collaborated with her. So her, I think, main argument is like there's been a hollowing out of local civic infrastructure in America. And this, the whole, like in the 50s and the 60s and before that, people were part of local associations, and those don't really exist. So I don't want to name names because I'll, alienate people, but like big environmental groups, big choice, a lot of big, like maybe not Planned Parenthood because they do have clinics, but there's a lot of organizations that have a staff in Washington or in a state capital and a mailing list and a donor list, and they're working that way. And so there's been this hollowing out, and it kind of parallels, if you know, some of the work with Robert Putnam and other people, is kind of hollowing out of community.
Bowling alone.
Or bowling alone about this. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I think is really important, and it happened in 2016, 2017, the whole Indivisible pop-up movement, huge number. The Hub for Progress, I've been part of several Indivisible groups. I've also in my life seen that come and go. Like I'm much more comfortable with that kind of grassroots, like the bubbling up. There's this woman, Rosa Luxemburg. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she was there's a great graphic novel about her called Red Rosa. I only recently found her, but she was like a after Marxist, socialist, pacifist, Polish, but in Germany. And she, like, one of the things that I attached to, and I'm just channeling her language, is in her exact language, but it's like the people are the wellspring of creativity that can create social change, and that's what's important. And that upper, like, it's not that organizations create that wellspring bubbles up, and then good organizations will like take advantage of it and like use it. And so going back to something you said earlier, which I'd like to say this, like my job is like being either a surfer or a gardener. So in 2020 and now I'm surfing the waves of energy that bubble up. And I think that professional organizers, and I say this with love, can sometimes lose sight of that because we get focused on like our organizations and our donors and all of that. And then I'm a gardener, right? So like most of the time I'm gardening rocky soil because you're trying to harvest that energy. And then when it comes, you're ready, and you got to switch. And it's kind of a different skill set. It's hard to be good at both. And I'm probably honestly better at surfing than I am gardening. Anywho, so what can people do? I am going to get to that. Be a part of an organization, be a part of a couple, or start them. When people who are like staff or whatever tell you there are too many organizations, that's bullshit. Sorry. That's not good.
It's okay, like, it happens.
Right? Like it's okay. Like if you're a part of a small organization that's like, we're part of this Indivisible chapter, or we don't even have a name, or we're angry about this, like you have a commitment to each other, and you're a certain I'm gonna use network language, you're a certain like sort of cohesion network. And the thing is, just connect to others. For Unitarians, like UU Justice PA, like I'm like, no one's winning an election in Pennsylvania by getting all the UUs to turn out. Like that's not what we're going to do. But and UU Justice PA actually kind of plug just recently hired a woman, Cherie Clark, to be doing like 501c3, so like nonpartisan work. But one of the things I think she could do would be like, if WellSprings has got people who are like, we would like to see more voter registration. Voter registration is important. It's really hard to do. It's really hard to do because the people who aren't registered are usually not registered for a reason, mm-hmm. Right? And so you have to kind of have conversations to overcome that. But what I'm trying to say is like, don't let, like, if you have a group, like find a group or start a group and just start doing things. And if people worry that you're duplicating efforts, that's like the thing that drives me crazy about usually well-meaning, like a lot of Unitarians, is like, they're like, maybe we're duplicating efforts. So what? Right? Because there is no one in charge who has the strategic plan who's going to tell you what to do. We're all trying to do the little pieces, and like the plan will come out of everybody doing those things. And so that's why I said join a group or several and talk to the other groups, because mm-hmm. the moments of strategic coordination will come out of those conversations, not from a top-down piece. So that's what I would say. And the other thing is, never apologize for not having time. Like when people are like, I'm sorry, I didn't come to the I get it. You have a life. You have a grandparent you have to take care of. You have kids or whatever. Like self-care is a movement strategy, and it always has been. So it is totally fine to step back. You don't need to apologize. So do what you can, join a group and several groups, and help those groups connect, and don't apologize. I would say those three things.
Mm. Are there, so WellSprings is kind of in a space also where we are a young congregation. Like I mentioned, we started in 2007. And we also, as a collective community, started our first social justice team after the 2016 election, right? So mm-hmm. we're thinking also about what we should do. Do you work with any faith communities as a whole in your organizing? Or do you have any suggestions for how whole communities could get involved in more movements that are in keeping with our UU values?
We do, yeah, for sure. And I mentioned I'm an atheist, and
Mhm.
I get probably more angry at what I call, or I get more bothered by angry atheists than I do intolerant people, like people of faith. Like I sort of say I'm in the happy atheist club. Like trying to convince somebody who's a person of faith that they shouldn't believe in God is just like them trying to convince me that they're like it's a faith question. So like, what are you doing?
Mhm.
And there is a certain um, I feel like there's a certain part, this part of the progressive movement that is very concerned about like they want to see social change happen in the United States without a deep faith component, and I don't think that's ever happened. I think
Mhm.
faith leaders have always been a key part of the social justice movements in the United States. So it's a fantasy. It's some sort of honestly maybe Marxist fantasy that there'll be this like revolution from below without religion. Like that's bonkers. So we're always looking to work with faith groups. I
Mhm.
know a lot of moderate mainstream Christians in my networks who are terrified by the Christian nationalism, which shouldn't even be called Christian. Um, so anyway, I would say, and you Justice can help with this, another plug, but we have several Justice teams, but like, um, maybe it would be hard because it's Unitarians, but like, talk about what's accessible, right? Like, I don't know where your building is in Chester County, like where it is, but like, you know, can the building be open for another community partner? Like partnerships is the way.
Mhm.
Uh, so, whatever that looks like. Um, there's a lot going on now. I just thought of this. Sorry. I think one of the things about like both Occupy and After is, in my experience, there's a 16 to 30-year-old set more or less who are very burned out on politics. Understandably, I'm burned out on it too. Honestly, like it's important, but I'll do it. They want to do direct action things or mutual aid or whatever you want to call it, or anarchism or solidarity. Like all of that to me, strong concept. I don't care what you call it.
Mhm.
So if there's people in your congregation, feeding the unhoused or the hungry, doing things that are solidarity, not charity. Like I imagine you're already talking about that. So like do that and do it with partners. I
Yeah.
don't know if that helps. Like if you put 15 Unitarians who want to do social justice, you said, what's the most important issue you want to work on? They're not going to be.
Yeah.
So maybe start with, we're going to work on something, and it may not be your number one, but it's going to be good work. What
Yeah.
we did an exercise a couple of years ago with some rural organizers, and we modeled something people might have seen where we basically created a physical space, and we said, how important is with X? How important to you is it to like how important to you is like what's going on with the environment or with youth and all of them. We said that, and then we said how important is it. So for example, we said how important is the environment to you? Like stand over here if it's important, over here if it's less important. Well, a bunch of nobody, everybody's trying to get near the line for what's important. And
Right.
then we said how much of your time can you spend on it, and then people differentiated.
Yeah.
And the point was, there's a metaphor about the chain is as weak as the weakest link, and I think a lot of progressives are like, I gotta either avoid the weakest link or help the weakest link. Like, what is the weakest link? And I'm like, don't do that. Work on what you want to work on, because the thing is, a rope is stronger the more braids, the more threads you braid into it, and we need to be a rope and braid together many threads, not worry about the weakest link chain. Like that is a kind of honestly capitalist managerial mindset about trying to find the point that's the least efficient. Social movements are not efficient. That's not the point.
Mm, mm, that's a good point. But it's not the point. The so the UUA hosted something called an
Mm-hmm.
organizing school that you might have heard
Mm-hmm.
about
No,
earlier this year.
I'm actually not deeply plugged into the EU. Like
That's
I'd like
fine.
to, but I don't
Yeah.
have time, and I'm not going to apologize.
I'm not as deeply plugged in probably as I should be either, but it caught my attention because of these questions that I was talking about that within our congregation have been bubbling up more and more for the last few years. And so the national denomination selected cohorts, groups from different congregations, teams all together that wanted to do this school that walked them through the basics of what is organizing,
Sounds
how do you,
awesome.
yeah. And so
I should have done it.
our congregation got to do that. Five of us from the congregation, and
Awesome.
it's wonderful also to hear a lot of resonance between what you're saying and what we learned in that
I'm
school.
getting a lot of resonance because I'm pretty self-taught, so I'm glad to
Yeah,
hear that.
yeah, and the especially thinking about capacity and time, right? Not
Mm-hmm.
just do you care about
Mm-hmm.
uh, racial justice issues? Do you care about
Mm-hmm.
the environment? Do you care about
Mm-hmm.
LGBTQ issues? But how much time are you willing to devote to do any of those things?
Mm-hmm.
Um, not as a shaming tool, like you said, not like you should be doing more, but to think about where is the energy naturally bubbling up within the community of people that you have gathered. And if they're willing to show up for that, then that's where you can mobilize, right? And
Mhm.
then the other piece of it is partners, right? I liked what you said before about, turning out every UU in the state of Pennsylvania is not going to swing anything, right?
No,
So
no.
who do we know, right? Who are we in relationship with? Where are we already supporting our
And
community? And can we work with them? Yeah.
I will say that, like, I'm in a fair number of conversations, virtual things that are meetings of other progressive groups, organizations. And somebody said, this is, I was wearing my UU Justice PA hat. And they said, oh, Unitarians, they're like, you're the people who show up. I was like, Well, there are 5,000 Unitarians in Pennsylvania and like 60, 38 congregations, I should know. We are small and we
Yeah.
punch way above our weight, way above our weight. And just kind of, I imagine the organizing school maybe said this. I know for me that, like, this is probably psychology on my part, but like some guilt and shame and, like, guilt of privilege. I grew up with a lot of economic privilege. That was a gateway drug to organizing. It's not a sustaining emotion. Like, feeling guilty or ashamed of being white or privileged or male or whatever, like, own it. Like, we all get, y'all, everybody's got to own their stuff, their shit, but it's not the basis for authentic relationships with people. We have several catchphrases which may be in the organizing school. Like, one is assume best intentions, another is lean in or step back. It's something I'm very much a talker. This is great for me, Lee, because I've got to talk. I'm having to learn to do that. So, um, like, I've always been concerned about politics and engaged in a volunteer way, like since 2016. And that was for me an inflection point, doing this more like intensely. Like, my colleagues in the trenches, I don't love war metaphors, but like, the other people who are the braids in that rope, like they're one of the reasons I stick around. And one of the wins for me, or one of the joys of this, is like, having been an academician and a professor for 15 years, like, yes, I was around a lot of very smart, educated people. And I would say that I know there are a lot of smart, interesting people outside of academia. And I just didn't have a chance to live that. And I'm just constantly humbled and amazed at how many people could have been, you know, people with very high academic credentials and just
or
aren't,
positional power, right? Yeah.
or positional power. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
If our systems were more equitable.
Right.
Yeah.
You said one thing about language, and I don't know if I'm going to sort of stick my foot in my mouth or stumble over something. I think language matters for sure, and like, we can all be better about language. I also think there's a danger to, like, the call out culture or whatever you want to call it. And there's like, it's like, if you goof and somebody calls you on it, own it. If everybody's like wants to make sure that, like, there's almost a weirdly kind of almost to me puritanical thing, like, you have to purify your mind, language, and actions before you can do anything. Screw that. Just go do stuff, right? Like, if you waited until you didn't have a rhesus bone in your body to work on racial justice, if you're a white person, you'd never do anything.
Yeah. Well, and that's also they're not necessarily ideas that are at odds with each other, because one of the things I often hear people talk about in this idea of a white supremacy culture, right, or that our culture is shaped by this idea that's old, but still affects us, that whiteness is somehow the best, and so that's part of how we learn, all of us. Part of that is that you can't make a mistake. Also, right, is this idea that you have to have it all together and you have to appear together at all times, right? So they're like, those ideas aren't actually at odds with each other, which I hear people argue about all the time. But it's like, what you just said
Thank you
isn't
for that.
negating any of that. It's saying, yeah,
Yep.
who says that you have to know how everything is supposed to be perfect before you go in and do anything, right? Like,
Yeah.
we
I'm
learn
totally
by doing.
I'm
Yeah.
totally stealing that. I'm also, I'm the son of a Spanish immigrant, and on the census, I'm labeled Hispanic, which I never ever claim that I'm not white. But I know some people in kind of progressive spaces sometimes who would immediately discount that I have anything to offer beyond, like, being able to reach out to, like, other middle-aged white men or whatever, straight men. I'm like, yeah, but like, you don't know that, like, when I play soccer in my community and I can speak in Spanish like pretty fluently, like, they love that. Like, today I was talking to some folks who are Dominican, and like, we all know that I'm not Afro-Caribbean. They love that I speak Spanish, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, there's this thing, is like, individuals always have more nooks and crannies than the categories they carry, and I think it's easy to forget that. And like,
Yeah.
one thing for me, having had the privilege of studying anthropology, was my undergraduate major, and like, you know, hanging out in places where I was a stranger is just that. Like, just let yourself be surprised by the incredible, and this is maybe a very Unitarian Universalist thing, you know, the incredible, uh, wonderful, sometimes horrible, strange, you know, uh, weirdness of it all. Like today, I drove by in my area, which is common, the Polish Slovenian Credit Union. Polish Slovenian Credit Union, what do you? I love it. So what is it? Polish. It's a credit union, Polish Slovenian. The second most Ukrainian state in the United States is Pennsylvania, and Schuylkill
Mhm.
County actually has
Mhm.
some wards that are close to 20% Ukrainian
Yeah.
ethnicity. It's great.
Yeah.
Just embrace it.
We're all a lot more complicated than we think we are. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have one last question for you, and then I'm
Yeah,
going to let you go. Um,
yeah,
and I actually sent this a little bit after I sent you my other questions to prepare, so I hope you got to
yeah.
see it.
No, I
Um,
did,
so,
and I think
just
about it all the time.
yeah, it's August, believe it or not, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
November is coming up, and if you watch TV, you know that November is coming up, and a lot of people that I talk to, myself, are
Yeah.
thinking about and are worried in a new way. I think about the upcoming election season, not just about is my side or your side going to win, but it seems like more extremist candidates are running for office these days. So many people are on edge right now, whether it's because of the economy or whether it's because basic human rights for their community or their family or the people they love or themselves seem to be more at risk. So it seems like there's a lot more at stake. And I just wanted to ask you, as somebody who has sort of been now around Pennsylvania politics and thinks about this a lot and is also experiencing this, do you share those worries? And if so, how do you cope? Like, how do you move through them?
Okay, so like every other answer, I started like big picture. Let me start with some specifics. Don't read polls. Uh, don't look at them. Just don't look at them. There is a whole business model that is about uh, uh, generating froth and the appearance of dynamics around polls that sells ads and that builds up your fear and concern and then crashes it.
Mm.
So, um, and and it drives me crazy. So that's one thing. Second thing is maybe like don't look at polls, but it is good to look at like arm's length analysis some. So there are some things that I think are pretty accurate. Um, one is the election dynamics in the United States keep changing and they keep moving away from a traditional model where in the primary you would like sort of run towards your base and then the general you would do the middle. Like I've seen the numbers, trust me. That is less and less true. There are very few people who are planning to vote, right? That's what we focus on. Who do we think is going to vote? And we're pretty good at predicting that. There are very few people who are persuadable anymore. And even at the local level, it used to be like, well, if you're going to run for Chester County, I don't know what you have, an executive council or whatever, or I can't remember the names of the
Supervisors,
towns,
board of supervisors.
supervisors, right, or borough council or whatever, mayor, you can run on local issues. I mean, uh, this was a few years ago. I ran for school board here, and somebody asked me my position on abortion. So because I
You will
think,
never vote on that as a school board member.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, I'll never
Yeah.
vote on that.
Mhm.
And moreover, like because there's this collapse of like local and sort of regional media, the people who are like and social media, like the ways in which Democrats and Republicans get frame each other and get framed is more salient up and down like the board. So it's like every election is nationalized, and and there are fewer persuasion voters. What that means is, and I know recently I said don't look at polls. I know that Fetterman and Shapiro seem to be doing better. It will tighten up. Those will be close elections because underneath that froth, I'm using that term, or that noise, is the reality that there's not a lot of people to persuade, and most campaigns, especially at the sort of all Pennsylvania level, are about which side can mobilize more of the people who will vote for them. And in general, people who will vote for our values, right? People who would tend to vote on progressive values. There are more of us, and we vote less frequently. So it's all about getting people who are willing to consider our values and our candidates to vote. So it will be close. It will be scary. Okay. Um, and I think having a kind of 6 month perspective versus a 1 week can kind of maybe help with some of that. Um, every time you think about like, I'm going to go on Twitter, I'm going to go on Facebook, or I'm going to send an email or whatever, don't do that. this is why you need to have a social justice team and like work on things. Like I am I am 100% sure that like practicing hope and not just hoping is always better. And like Twitter and all that. And I use Twitter a little bit. Yesterday, I looked at it to see what was going on with Kansas because I know I'd get more like up to date information. But like if you're doing any of that, and I'm somebody who uses social media a lot, and so I know what I'm talking about. Like yes, hi, my name's Jordi. I'm an addict, but like you really have to uh, like keyboard warriors. And we actually know this. Like when like campaigns, like digital organizing doesn't do a lot. It like helps amplify other things, but like trying to connect to people through social media, it's not clear that that actually changes any elections. It doesn't move any voters. So that's purely on the like election stuff. On like the issues and feeling threatened and all of that. And I know obviously with the Dobbs case, I have a daughter who's trans, uh, and like um, I don't know how to process that. Like I think I don't need to be motivated like on that old Spinal Tap, like this goes to 11. I'm already at 11 all the time. So like no amount of telling me it's gonna get worse is gonna do anything. So I'm not normal in that way and maybe not healthy, but like as bad as things can get, like as bad it was when Trump was elected, it seemed like he wanted to, start deporting Muslims or not letting them into the country, and people went to the airports. I'm going to say all of this not in a like everything will be okay. It's not that everything will be okay. It's that our capacity to be resilient and be responsive is usually greater than we assume it was. Does that make sense? So like the even where I am, the number of people who are doing what I said, starting to organize, doing protests. And I want to come back to the protest thing if we haven't gone on too long. I'll give it back in a second. But anyway, um, like if we will lose elections and sometimes things will get worse, but like trust in your other Unitarians, in your friends, and the people who share your values, that we will find ways to bounce back. One more thing about protests. Protests are good for people who need to find a way to get involved. And any protest you go to or organize, you should always get the names, phone numbers, and emails of everybody who's there. Make sure you keep it. And you should ask yourself, like, what do we want people to do next? Because uh, that is the key. Like protests and rallies are the gateway experience to engaged activism. And that we were talking about time earlier. That'll look different for different people. And all of that is good. All of that is good.
Great.
I don't know if that helps. Like,
I don't know. I don't know if it helps either.
there's a
but I
great thing.
appreciate it.
There's a really great thing that is from a woman. I'm blanking her name, but she talked about hope as a discipline. It's something you practice, and I think I was doing that without realizing it when I read that. I think it's pretty powerful. And she also talks about it's not a silly happy emotion. It's not like it's like because you're engaged in doing the work. And listen, I get it if you have a job, whatever. Like not like I'm in a place where I can be doing this all the time. That's not an expectation I have of other people.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Well, and
never do.
it changes your relationship to things. What you said about rather than just hoping that things are going to turn out all right, like practice it.
Mm-hmm.
I do both, I guess. I try to do both, right? But I notice how it changes my relationship to something when I show up and am part of the thing that um that if I had just stayed home and seen it on the news, I would have been like, oh, how great that those people did that thing, right? That's part of it. But when I go, I remind myself that I have power in that system, that it's not
Mm-hmm.
just me sitting around on the couch wondering how things are going to turn out and hoping to see something good happen. That I am practicing that muscle of saying, I actually have something to do about this. And I can help that change, not by myself, but when I show up, it makes a difference inside of me. It's almost the same as when Unitarians often talk about praying, right? And like, do we pray and why? Because do we really believe that it is going to change what happens? Maybe not, but it changes something inside of us to put our own stake in it, to put our own bodies on the line. Yeah. Yeah. Jordi, thank you so much for this conversation. This was great.
I learned a lot. Thank you.